Hi, I'm Roxy. I'm a science fiction and fantasy illustrator. I usually do book covers, but I've recently landed a very fun job illustrating a children's fantasy book, which is set in a forest. So, as you can imagine, I'm painting a fair bit of background scenery. And one thing I'm keeping top of mind the entire time is atmospheric perspective. Not just the technically correct way of using it, but also how I kind of cheated in where it doesn't really belong. And I'm going to show you how. Now, perspective is a fundamental of art theory. It's one of the first things you learn from any decent high school art teacher. But we're talking about linear perspective. And just so we're all on the same page, I can briefly define it as horizontal lines that all converge to either one point in the horizon or 2 points on the horizon. And the horizon is based on the perspective of the viewer. So some people don't even call it a horizon line. When they're talking about perspective, they refer to it as eye level. Most art only uses 1 or 2 point perspective, but you also get 3, 4, and 5 point perspective. But you know what? I will leave that off for a future video. I think that could be fun. But the whole purpose of following the rules of a linear perspective is to make your scene more believable. If you make sure to line up everything in your scene according to the perspective lines, and you make sure that the further away the object is, the smaller it gets, and the narrower the spacing between objects, it's just going to look right. So it's important and it's useful, but there is another kind of perspective, and that is called atmospheric perspective. Some people call it aerial perspective, but it's the same thing. It's interchangeable phrases. And if I had to sum it up in the most rudimentary way, I could say that the further away an opaque object gets from the viewer, the more blue it becomes in color, and the more hazier and less distinct it becomes. There is a bit more nuance to it, though. As painters, most of what we know about atmospheric perspective comes from the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was fascinated with light and shade, and he makes a ton of observations throughout his notes. He doesn't necessarily group it under a convenient atmospheric perspective headline. It's all over the place. In one place, he might talk about prospettiva area, which translates to aerial perspective. In other places, he talks about prospettiva di colori, which translates as perspective of colors. And he also talks about prospettiva de perdimenti, which translates as perspective of the losses. And all of these snippets here and there, they make up what we know about atmospheric perspective. So to give you a quick rundown, the further away an opaque object gets, the more it starts taking on the color of the atmosphere, typically blue. So colors become less vivid, less distinct from each other, and more blue. Da Vinci actually said that if it's 5 times as far from you, it should be 5 times as blue. Now, this prior mentioned effect of things getting bluer and less saturated, etc., it's less obvious when things are directly lit by the sun. If something's lit by the sun, it maintains its vividness and, it's not as blue. The shadow areas, on the other hand, they get quite blue. They're more obviously blue, and also dark areas and dark colors, shadow areas, they tend to overall get lighter, and they flatten out in value, which means, you don't really see the difference between something that's dark or slightly darker than that. It just kind of flattens out. The blue thing, I should also say, is more obvious in the morning because of moisture in the air. Afternoon scenes might not disappear into blue because there's naturally less moisture in the air. It's more dusty, so the colors might end up taking on an ashy or smoky look, he says. Also, regarding moisture, the sky gets darker the further it moves up from the horizon because mist and moisture hangs closest to the ground. And so it's light by the horizon, and then it gradually gets darker as we look up. Besides color and atmosphere, he also points out the loss of small details. The further away an object is from the viewer, the more small details it loses. He gives the example of trees, where he says that leaves can either be lit or in shade or have luster, which, from what I can gather, he's talking about glossiness, or have transparency. And when a tree's leaves are mostly one of those things, then from a distance it will be completely that thing. So, for example, a tree with most of the leaves in shade, if you look at it in the distance, it will look like it's completely in shade, as all the lit leaves get kind of swallowed up by its surroundings, which is the dark leaves. The atmosphere doesn't only swallow up detail, but the edges of things also become hazy and less distinct, and the shape of things just gradually gets rounder and rounder as edges get less distinct, so things become rounder. And he also makes observations about very specific scenarios, like when a painter tries to represent a battle with smoke and dust in the air. He says that the figures in that battle, when they're between the observer and the light, at a distance, the figures will appear dark on a light background, and the lower part of their legs near the ground will be least visible because that's where the dust and smoke is thickest. So Da Vinci has a good amount of these types of observations, not necessarily all perspective related. There's all kinds of painting tips. There's philosophy, there's science, if you're into that. By the way, if it sounds like I'm trying to sell you the book, I'm not. You can get it for free via Project Gutenberg, link in description. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's interesting to look through for all painters, but obviously atmospheric perspective in particular is vital for landscape painters. Here's an example. This is an American luminist painter called Frederick Church. And this looks like a misty morning. All this green foliage is becoming bluer and less distinct the further away it is. And here's another American luminist, Albert Bierstadt. His atmosphere isn't blue, it's kind of a dusty afternoon, so the horizon is blending into that gold atmosphere. Here's something more contemporary. It's a night scene by a fantasy painter called Andreas Rocha. The graveyard scene, the further away it gets in the distance, is getting swallowed up by that blue atmosphere. For a sci-fi example, here's a clip I actually took while playing Dune Awakening. Notice how absolutely vivid the colors and the details are up close, and how the background just fades into smoky dust. Now, atmospheric perspective isn't just for landscapes, though. It's also vital for people who like to include detailed natural backgrounds to their foreground subject matter, like Leonardo da Vinci. Here he is putting his observations to practice. Notice how the colors of the background all get gradually more blue the further away we get, and the details also get more and more hazy. And you don't notice the background at first, which is exactly the point. You don't want the background competing for attention with your main subject matter. The foreground is the main actor, the background is the supporting actor. Rendered realistically enough to support the main subject but not stealing the show. When it comes to modern day art, fantasy and sci-fi art in particular thrive on atmospheric perspective because there's almost always a character or creature that not only needs to be painted in its environment, but needs to be the star of it. Here's one of my favorite artists of all time, Ekaterina Burmak. She's got this crazy lush background with tentacles that you don't even really notice because it's disappearing into that blue-green funk of whatever that environment is. Here's one by Greg Rutkowski. He's really pushed the atmospheric perspective, so there's a very clear separation of foreground and background. It makes the creature immediately readable. And for this exact same reason, photographers will deliberately set their camera apertures wider to get that shallow depth of field look that's so beautiful for portraits. We all want the subject of the art or the photograph to be the star, and for that to be the case, the silhouette of the subject needs to be clearly readable and not blending in with things in the background. And we can take inspiration from the photographers and deliberately apply atmospheric perspective much closer than it scientifically should be. As an example, I'll show you some of my own work. The book isn't out yet, but I have permission from the author to show you some of the illustrations I've been doing. And I'm by no means pretending that I invented this kind of cheating, for lack of a better word. I'm just one of many artists taking advantage of it. And once I point it out, you'll start noticing it everywhere. So the trick is to use the same principles that we apply to the background, but we apply it instead or as well to the midground and the closer objects in a much more aggressive way to make sure that the foreground stuff is beautifully defined. This one is a doorway into a magical forest. The author wanted the trees knitted together in a kind of heart shape. So this is what I came up with. And you can see as we go deeper into the forest, the trees start fading off. Just like Da Vinci observes, the shadows get lighter, colors start to blend into each other. Instead of a blue tinge, I've gone with purple because, you know, it's a magical forest. The detail fades. You see I've stopped adding bark detail back there. Everything is just homogenizing, making the foreground a lot easier to see. But one thing I didn't like is how these trees that are not really that far away kind of blend into the foreground trees, making the heart shape less clear. Fortunately, I've got the foreground on a separate layer, so I just slid a layer in between the foreground and those trees. Grabbed an airbrush, slapped some purple on from the color wheel, and I painted over the tops over there with this kind of purple fog, and then I lowered the opacity of the layer. Is that technically correct according to the observable science? Not really, but it's subtle enough that no one's going to call me out on it, and now the shape just reads better. Here's another one. On this page, now we're inside said magical forest, and I had to paint an owl with silver, gold, and copper coloring sitting in a rainbow eucalyptus of the same colors. Now, I originally didn't have this branch in the back here, and I felt it needed a branch because the tree, the whole scene, it was looking like a cardboard cutout. It was looking too flat. But the problem, of course, is if I painted a branch in the back with the same intensity of values and colors as the rest of the tree, the detail, it would just obscure the shape of the owl. Now, I might not be able to break the laws of physics in real life, but in a painting I can, and you can't stop me. So even though this branch is part of the same tree, not some distant thing by any stretch of the imagination, I decided to apply some gratuitous atmospheric perspective. You'll notice the colors and values of this branch as it extends away from the owl start to blend together, and as a result, the owl figure just reads a lot better. And by now, I'm sure you figured out that you don't only have to use this atmospheric hack for outdoor scenes. This is a painting I did for another client, and at the sketch stage, I saw it was going to be a bit of a challenge to separate the foreground clearly from the very detailed stained glass window, which was also important to the client, but still needed to take a back seat. This is the thing about illustration. So much of it is actually about problem solving, but it's fun problems. So I immediately started thinking about how I could abuse atmospheric perspective to strengthen the character silhouettes. And so here's my second draft, where all I did was I placed a blue layer at low opacity in between the fore and background. And here's my final polished version, which isn't quite as obvious as the sketch, But you can see what I did was I utilized some of the light beams coming through the window to create like an atmospheric haze around the chair in the foreground, so that it stood out a lot better. And up here, I used a little bit of rim light because I figure it's backlit, so I'm allowed. So, moral of the story is artists are not only using atmospheric perspective because it's scientifically observable, but we're shamefully abusing it as well because it's really effective at separating the foreground from the background. So, anytime you want your foreground to stand out more, just create some fake atmosphere behind it, and that'll do the trick. You're welcome. Thanks to my patrons, and thank you for watching. Much obliged if you leave a like and subscribe. Until the next one, God bless.